and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt. And God said, I'm going to be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. Well, why were the children of Israel even in Egypt? You remember?
Famine.
Because of a famine. And they went down there, and Joseph was already there.
Here, I think we missed it. God created famine. God gave Joseph the dreams. God wanted the people of Israel to realize they needed to be saved from something. If they hadn't been slaves, they'd never realized that. That's the same thing with us. If we don't realize sin, we don't realize that we need saving.
I think that's exactly right. It was because God made a promise to Abraham. He told him, right, and one of the very first things that he said to him, I'm going to bless those that bless you. I'm going to curse those. Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and there'll be servants there, and they will be afflicted 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterwards they'll come out with great possessions. So he did this because God keeps all of his promises, the good ones and the bad ones. God doesn't show any partiality. When he makes a promise, he said they're going to be there for 400 years. They're there for 400 years. So I ask myself, is it productive to ask, why Egypt? I mean, he could have sent them anywhere. He could have sent them off into the wilderness down there towards Saudi Arabia, or he could have sent them north up along the Fertile Crescent to Syria and Babylon. And so it's not always productive to ask why to questions that you don't really have direct answers to. But at the same time, he gave us an imagination, and I got to looking at Egypt and Canaan on a map, and I thought, there's things that God said, like taking the book of Revelation. There's a difference between just listening to what's read there, listening to what's preached. And then at the end of all of those, he said, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. And I think what he's trying to tell us is there's more to that statement than what you just read. Think about it. He only wrote to 7 churches. Has there only been 7 churches in all of the histories of the churches of Christ? Has there only been 7 churches that have problems? Has there ever been only just one church that had thought that they were hot when they were cold, or thought that they were or ended up that they were lukewarm? You wish they were hot or cold, that they were lukewarm. So I think we should pay attention to what things say with having an ear that hears, so that our lampstand doesn't get taken away. And that could be a lesson even for just a different time too. So I started asking myself, well, why Egypt? Look at the way that thing is located geographically. The easiest thing to say, well, it's all part of the plan. It had to be somebody, so it was God's choice. So he just picked Egypt for whatever reason he wanted. If you look at the geography, there's only one way in and one way out of Egypt from Canaan. So that was kind of interesting too, because how did they get out? They didn't go out the normal way, did they? How did they get out?
The Red Sea.
They went through a wall of water. Yeah, that was one thing that was, but two, was Egypt? At that time in history,
Probably one of the greatest civilizations that ever existed.
yeah,
They were wealthy.
pyramids and the wealth that they had. They had all of the wealth of Egypt that talks about, and all of the things that we read about Egypt, even in history now, and we have no idea what it was really like back then, to think of, we're just poor dirt farmers here in South Judea, south of Israel, the Negev.
And Moses had lived there as a child.
Moses, yeah, and he was raised in, what did it say? He was raised in all of the education of Egypt. So they were one of the most advanced civilizations on the planet. They were also probably one of the most powerful. It seemed like their armies, you had to go a long ways out of your way to defeat them, but it doesn't seem like anybody ever came up from South Africa or West Africa to defeat them. When it talks about Egypt in the Bible, it just seems like Egypt is Africa. They own everything. I know that's not true, that they didn't have it all, but they were the big guys on the block, so to speak, on that whole continent.
If you look at the map and look at all that green, you can see that that area could sustain people because they could grow crops and their animals would have food to eat. That was the place that would sustain them and let them grow and get richer.
Exactly. That was the most fertile land for growing people. I remember a friend of mine told me about his time during the Dust Bowl and the Depression. His dad had died, and he was young, not even a teenager then, trying to run a plow behind a mule and planting the corn in West Tennessee, and the wind was blowing and it was all dry and everything, and you go, and they attended church. They rode a mule to church, and they attended church regularly. Christian, his mom was wise way beyond her years. He said, "Mama, if God loves us, how come the corn won't grow?" And she said, "God isn't interested in growing corn. He's interested in growing men." And so he learned things like that from his mother, that, it was beyond the physical that God's trying to get us to think. And that's it. Not only were they going to be able to survive there physically, but they were going to grow there exponentially and become that great nation and fulfill that other promise that he had made to Abraham. And how many times did God remind Israel in the next 60 books? How many times did he remind Israel that it was him that brought them out of Egypt? Probably nobody's done a count, and I didn't. I just did a word search thing in there. But about 650 to 730 times that God says to the children of Israel, "It was me that brought you out of Israel." And that was important. Why? Why was it important that they be reminded that it was that God had brought them out of Egypt?
That he was the one who saved them.
He was the one that saved them. That's right. They didn't save themselves. They were in an impossible situation. And Egypt now represented, Egypt would end up representing a lot of things to a lot of different people in Israel. I mean, to the kings, it represented military power, and they went there for horses, and they went there for chariots. To the rich, Egypt probably represented prosperity and wealth and lifestyle. And even the technology that they probably had was beyond the majority of everybody in South Israel or in Israel at that time was agricultural. They had some traders. Israel had a little more in the merchant area. Bill?
God raised up Pharaoh to show God's glory. That's how that happened.
Yep, and he did that too. And he did that for that very purpose. But to some of the Israelites, to some of them, the prophets especially, but to some of them, Egypt meant slavery. Egypt meant bondage. Egypt meant forced labor and no freedom. So those are some of the whys that I came up with. Why Egypt? Because of what Egypt would come to represent. And by the time we get to when that whole passage comes out, it was Hosea, shortly before Israel was going to be taken off into promised exile. It was Hosea who uttered those lines, when Israel was a child, I loved him. And out of Egypt I called my son. The more they were called, the more they went away. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and burning offerings to idols. And yet it was I who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them up by their arms, but they did not know that I was the one that healed them. I led them with cords of kindness, with bands of love, and I became to them as one who eases the yoke on their jaws, and I bent down to feed them. But they didn't realize any of that. And so maybe this is what, I try to put myself back, maybe this is what that meant to them. When Hosea said, prophecies always mean something to the people that they're told to the immediate audience that they're told to. So we're going to have, in this prophecy, we've got 2,700 years or more of people that have heard this. So, but we've gone a lot of different places in history, so it had to have meant some different things to different people at different times. To the people of Hosea's day, I'm guessing that this meant it was a reminder of where they had come from and how far they had fallen. I'm the one that brought you out of Egypt. I called you my son out of Egypt. And I fed you, and I made your yoke easy, but you just keep going away from me. You just keep trying to do things your own way. They were fascinated with Egypt. It just seemed like even when they were coming out of Egypt, isn't it odd that when you're reading the Exodus, when they're coming out of Egypt, that they keep complaining, we had it so much better back then. I'm thinking, not from what I've read, you didn't. That's pretty odd that you would say, oh, the lentils and the meat and the food and the variety and stuff we have, and all we got is this man all over the place. So they just had this fascination with Egypt. They feared their military power, but they loved their lifestyle.
And that they were slaves. I mean, they were being treated as such, even in Egypt. But God's going to show them something far worse than how the way Egypt treated, and that's whenever he turns them over to Assyria.
Yeah, and that's just it. He's given them a physical, Egypt's going to represent a physical example of a spiritual fact. Yeah.
Today, people will strive to raise their credit score, get more stuff, and decrease labor.
Very good application. sin looks appealing to us for different reasons. You know, they envied that Egyptian lifestyle even though they didn't have it. I tend to drive down Lakeshore Drive and round through there, and when we're building the house, we're getting some of the design books. I notice how these home design books never show a home in there that's less than $1 million. There's nothing in any of them. I can't afford a bathtub this stuff in it. You know, and so I don't know why I even buy them, because I'm a little bit envious of that lifestyle. I think of how there's really not that many millionaires in this country. There's a lot, but there's really not that many. And when you start looking at just Lakeshore Drive and around the lake and stuff there, you're going, where's all this come from? What did I miss in school? But in reality, sin is bondage, sin is slavery, sin is forced labor, and there isn't any freedom there. So there's a song, I can't remember where it is right off the bat. I think it's 72 or 71 in there somewhere, where he said, I almost slipped when I saw how easy the rich had it. And I'm paraphrasing because he started feeling envious about all of the things that they had. And then he realized when he went to the temple, he realized how slippery of a slope that they were on, and that how their end is not good, and how working for God is what reality is. They were fascinated with Egypt, but what he said, you're not going back to Egypt. They shall not return to the land of Egypt, but Assyria shall be their king because they have refused to return to me. Like Don said, he was going to show them just how bad it could be. You thought Egypt was bad? I'm going to give you king of Assyria to serve because you've refused to turn to me. And now you're going to see what bad really is. So to the people of Jesus' day, I missed a. That was to the people of Hosea's day. Okay. To the people of Jesus' day. Anyway, I was going to say this. Their love for Egypt took them where they never intended to go, kept them there longer than they ever intended to stay, and cost them more than they ever wanted to pay. I copied that from a preacher that I heard years ago, and I don't even remember exactly who it was that said it. But the prophecy also had a forward look to it. As when we read it, what do we think of it as? It's a messianic prophecy, is it not? So to the people of Jesus' day, when they looked at that, they must have thought something. They're looking through the scriptures. They're searching the scriptures because they're looking for the Messiah. And so it must have meant something to them of that day. What was it intended to mean to them? Why should they have paid attention to that particular poem that Hosea, that prophecy that Hosea had written?
My thoughts go back to Moses saying there will be a prophet like me. Moses wasn't just a prophet, he was a leader, he was a deliverer. He delivered them out of Egypt. So his son coming out of Egypt chose him to be that prophet and that deliverer out of bondage.
Okay?
That's the way I see it today. I don't know if that's the way they necessarily saw it.
Yeah, I don't know exactly what they thought, but Jesus read this prophecy. No, I take that back. We don't have, Jesus read some prophecies to them and said, today this prophecy is fulfilled in your hearing. So he was telling them that he was the Messiah. Then that should have got them to start looking. But the people of Jesus' day, that should have meant somewhere it was known that Jesus had been down in Egypt till Herod died and then came back. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't.
Well, I mean, there would have to be that way of explaining, because people would wonder, if you were born in Bethlehem at that time, how did you escape Herod's purging?
How did you escape all of that killing? So it was another indication that Jesus of Nazareth was the Christ. There's so many. That's a really good lesson too. Look at the messianic prophecies then that are in the Old Testament, and then see how every one of them is fulfilled in Jesus. And another thing that's really cool too is the scriptures were being fulfilled right in front of their eyes. The scriptures are being fulfilled right in front of our eyes too. But unless we see with spiritual eyes, a lot of times we don't see that. People are always trying to take physical things that have happened and apply them to the prophecies that were of those days and say, yeah, this means we're in the last days because this war is happening right now, or this leader is in charge right now. So, we must be in the last days, and people start predicting how many days it is until Jesus is going to return and what year or whatever like that. When he says, out of Egypt I call my son, these scriptures were being fulfilled right in front of their eyes. Now, it wasn't until afterwards, it was the New Testament writer Matthew that wrote this after Jesus had already ascended. So by him writing it after Jesus had already ascended, it must have meant that there's a meaning, or it must have been intended that there would be a meaning to future listeners. So what does this mean to me today? This is what Matthew wrote. He took the mother and the child and by night departed to Egypt. He was there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled that which was spoken by the Lord through the prophet, saying, out of Egypt I called my son. So it was written after the fulfillment of Hosea's prophecy for future generations as proof that Jesus is who he says he is.
Yeah, it goes along with, at the time of Matthew's writing, they still had the temple. The same reason he included the genealogy was so that they could go back and identify that. Because there's no doubt he wrote to a Jewish audience. And those Jews would say, okay, we know this happened. How did he escape that? How did he not? And where did he come from Egypt? If he was born in Bethlehem, how was it that he was called out of Egypt? So all those things, Matthew includes those things so that the answers are there for those current people. And for us as future, we can see it today. We see him as that prophet. We see him as that deliverer.
That's exactly right. That it's well, I'll ask you before I tell you what I was thinking. What does it mean to you today when you read a prophecy like that and read that it was fulfilled? We know what the physical part of that is. It's physically been fulfilled. It was physically said. But what is it? What goes on in your head, Teresa?
For me, I look back at all the people that were held in bondage and put in pits and put in prison and put in slavery. And I see the comparison that we have freedom through Christ, and we're free from the bondage of sin. Those chains will not hold us if we turn to Christ. And we see the difficulty, how hard it was to get people out of slavery, how hard it was to get them out of other countries, how hard it was for them to survive the fiery furnace. But God delivered in a physical sense. He delivers in a spiritual sense.
That's very good. That's very good. Bill?
I look at the Bible, I guess, in ways other people don't. But I love chemistry and I love physics. Every time you mix one hydrogen and two oxygens, you get water. And the Bible, to me, is just as exact and just as perfect as that is. Every time you give, you get more. Works every time. And every time the Bible says, do this, this will happen. If you do that, that'll happen. If it's good or bad. It'll tell you how it's going to turn out. And to me, that's very encouraging. That's the prophecy that comes before your eyes.
That's a prophecy that's being fulfilled right before your eyes. That's exactly right. What does that mean on a spiritual level then? If I do this, where am I going to end up?
If the physical,
Is that,
if the physical will pay off, the spiritual will pay off.
Amen.
that's it. That's right there. If there was a physical payoff, then there's going to be a spiritual payoff. That's where I was. It's one more affirmation to me. It's one more affirmation when I read the scriptures that Jesus is the Christ. I mean, how hard it was 38 years before I always thought it, but it was 38 years in my life before I actually confessed that I really believe that Jesus is the Christ of God, that he was and he is, and everything in there that it says is true. And that was the other thing. One more affirmation that the Bible is God's revealed word, because nobody else has ever done prophecies. No other philosopher or anything like that has ever done prophecies that have come true and been fulfilled in the detail, not just the physical detail, but the spiritual detail too.
Even the very minute detail, just as that out of Egypt I called my son. We look at that prophecy and it's just such a very minute detail that it would be easy to overlook
Oh yeah.
and see it's not even there. But God says, hey, I prophesied this, here's where I fulfilled it.
We even call them minor prophets, don't we? So hardly any of us ever studied them because of that. But it's also more than that to me too, because then you read that and then you want to read the context of it to see what he was talking about. And if you read the context of that, the rest of the context of that is not very good. Out of Egypt I called my son, but the more I called, the farther away they went. So it's a reminder to me that Jesus is the one that's calling me out of sin, and why I don't want to go back there. I don't want to do like what they did when God is calling me. I don't want to turn and run the other direction like Jonah did. But he did, and he was probably a better man than I am. So these are my conclusions to this lesson, sort of. The gospel is still calling sinners out of Egypt to become sons and daughters of God. And that prophecy doesn't always just have a physical fulfillment, but it has a spiritual application as well, because what does the gospel tell us? Not everyone that he called out of Egypt entered into his rest, did they? We read in Hebrews 3, 7 through 19 of what happened to those people that got called out of Egypt. How many of them got into the promised land? 2. And then how does chapter 3 in Hebrews end? The last verse, or the last 2 verses. The ones that died, all died in unbelief because they disobeyed. And that's the only place I've ever seen that always remember that disobedience equals unbelief. So that's why that doesn't work to say, I believe in God, I believe in Jesus as his son, but I live however I want to live. And God's just got to be good with that. Disobedience equals unbelief. You can't tell me that you love God and you hate your brother. That's what John said. If you hate your brother, you can't say I love God.
It pains me to see sincere Christians that I know and think a lot of practicing Christianity in such a way that reminds me of a person who buys a Ferrari and uses a team of mules to pull it around.
Wow, what a great analogy. I have to remember that. That's a good one. That's a good one.
Wait a minute, repeat that again. Repeat what?
It reminds Christianity to a lot of people, it reminds them of somebody who buys a Ferrari and uses a team of mules to pull it around.
Okay.
And I've heard it stated other ways. We have this $1 million salvation, and we have such a 2-bit response to it. That's what Bill's saying there. We've got a Ferrari of a salvation. Don't hitch up an old mule to it to pull it around. It's what it's intended for. Good analogy. Many are called, but few are chosen. 600,000 people were called out of Egypt. 2 made it. Matthew reminds us that. Jesus reminded us of it when afterwards Matthew wrote it down. But Jesus reminded them that not everybody that says to me, Lord, Lord, will be accepted. I misparaphrased that or misquoted that. In John 15 and 16, he said, you did not choose me. I chose you to go and bear fruit. Judas Iscariot chose not to go and bear fruit. So in essence, he unchose God's redemption. The redemption was there. It's there for everybody. And he does that so that we will accept it and go and bear fruit. If we choose not to bear fruit, that goes back to the disobedience equals unbelief. By not bearing fruit, we unchoose God's redemption. So there again, it falls squarely into our laps. God has put it there for us. It's all by grace that we're saved. But we have the power of choice whether to accept it, whether to receive it or not. And then you remember the words of Peter when he was admonishing the people of the dispersion. In the end, he said this, this is what Egypt did to them. They promised freedom, but they themselves are slaves of corruption. Whatever overcomes a person, to that he is enslaved. If after they have escaped the defilements of the world through the knowledge of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, and they are again entangled up in them and overcome, the last state of that person is becomes worse for them than the first state. In other words, don't go back to Egypt. Don't go back there. If you've got to be a slave to something, as Paul stated in Romans, be a slave to righteousness, because the end is much better. Even if the lifestyle doesn't look appealing to the human eye, like the lifestyle of the world, like all of what we see around us and stuff, the spiritual eye sees that if we miss heaven, we miss everything. And that's what I came to say. And I'll give the floor to you.
If people have a problem with Christianity, it's so hard, so tough, you got so many problems. They could see my world where you see people that weren't Christians and the problems they had.
It is. It's sad. It's sad to see that because we're looking at things with different eyes. We have, as 1 Corinthians would say, we have the mind of Christ. We've read what he said. We can see where their end is. Like the psalmist said, I almost slipped when I saw the prosperity of the wealthy. Because they don't have any pangs in their death. They have fat eyes. They have big houses and fast cars and nice views of the lake or whatever. But when I went to the house of God, I perceived what their end was. They're on a slippery slope. And it's sad to see that happening.
The retirement for Christians is out of this world.
I'm sorry?
The retirement benefits for Christians is out of this world.
That's exactly right. Yep, very well said. Thank you. That's all I have in this lesson. Appreciate you listening.
Oh.
Wednesday, okay.
Did your parents get back?
I don't know if they got back to, yeah, I think they might get back today. I'm not sure exactly what day, and I haven't heard because they don't have internet all week, so I think it's today.
You can use it, it just costs.
Yeah, right, yeah, they just didn't pay for it.